That's what he told me the night we buried his father. I remember how cold my fingers felt, even though it was spring. I remember how he held my hand with both of his and leaned in, voice shaking just enough to sound sincere. "You'll always have a place with us, Mom," he said. The words settled into my chest like warm tea sweet, soothing something I could hold on to through the ache. In that moment, I believed him. I believed him with every tired part of me that had just buried the man I'd shared a life with for over 4 decades. A life that started with laughter and babies and ended with long silences and a hospital bed. Still, I had loved him. I had cared for him until his last breath. And then I stood at that grave alone, in the deepest way a woman can be alone. And my son, my sweet boy, gave me somewhere to rest that feeling, or so I thought. A week after the funeral, I packed a suitcase, just one. I didn't want to be a burden. I left behind most of my things, my old teacups, the photo albums, the faded recliner where I used to sit beside my husband at sunset. I told myself I'd come back for them later when I was stronger. I locked the door of that house like I was closing a book that no longer had new chapters to offer me. My son picked me up in his car, clean newer than I remembered, and the drive was quiet. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, as if the air between us had changed. He asked if I was okay, and I nodded. He didn't ask again. Their house was lovely, too lovely. Everything was white and polished and smelled of lavender-scented cleaners. It didn't smell like children or stew or the faint must of an old cardigan drying by the radiator. I felt like I was stepping into a catalog. His wife met us at the door, polite, not warm. She smiled and said it was good to have me. She touched my elbow like I was fragile. I smiled back and lied that I was fine. They gave me the guest room upstairs. It had crisp linens and no clutter. I stood in the doorway and felt like a visitor in a hotel, not a mother, returning to her son. I ran my hand along the dresser and remembered how I used to fold his little socks and place them in drawers just like this, only cheaper, scratched, worn, with love. That night I lay down and tried not to cry. But the quiet pressed in, not the peaceful kind, the lonely kind, the kind that made you feel forgotten, even when you were surrounded by walls. The next morning I woke up early as I always do. Years of routine making breakfast, letting the dog out, feeding a husband with shaky hands, had trained my body to rise before the sun. I tiptoed to the kitchen, trying not to make noise. I didn't know where anything was, so I fumbled in drawers gently as I could. I found a kettle and started water for tea. The click of the stove felt like thunder. I winced. She came in then, his wife wearing a robe and a startled look. "Oh," she said, surprised. "I didn't expect you up so early." "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I was just making tea." She gave a tight smile and nodded, but I felt it. That slight pause. That unspoken suggestion that perhaps I'd overstepped. I wasn't used to asking permission to boil water. I stood there, unsure of whether to keep going or quietly vanish into the walls. My son came down later, kissed her on the cheek, gave me a quick morning, Mom, and then asked if I'd slept well. I said yes. He didn't ask what I dreamed. If he had, I might have told him the truth, that I dreamed I was back in my old kitchen with his father, humming off key, and eggs frying in a pan, and the floor creaking beneath my slippers. That I dreamed of belonging. Instead, I smiled and said yes. That first day was filled with small moments like that. Nothing cruel, nothing you could write down and prove. Just edges. Invisible fences that told me where not to step. I offered to help with lunch, but his wife said, "Oh, we've got it." I asked if she needed help folding laundry, and she laughed lightly. "You're supposed to be resting, aren't you?" So I rested. on a couch that wasn't mine with a book I couldn't focus on, while life happened around me, but not with me. They talked to each other in glances I couldn't read. I watched the baby crawl across the floor and felt the ache in my chest, not just from age, but from wanting to be needed and not knowing how anymore. That night, in the quiet of my borrowed bed, I lay staring at the ceiling and replayed my son's words from the cemetery. "You'll always have a place." But maybe what he meant was, "You'll have a place, just not one that makes us uncomfortable." I'd always been an early riser, not because I liked the dawn, but because life never gave me the luxury of sleeping in. When my son was little, I'd be up before him making porridge and pressing his school shirts. Later it was work, then taking care of my husband when his body started giving out before his spirit did. My hands didn't know how to be still in the morning, but in their house, stillness felt like survival. I remember walking on the edges of my feet like I used to, when he was a baby asleep in the next room. Only now I wasn't trying to protect his sleep, I was trying not to be heard. I crept into the kitchen in my socks, careful not to let the floorboards creak. I didn't even know if they had creaky boards. The house was too new, too smooth. Still, I moved like a ghost, opening drawers, with 2 fingers easing them shut, like they might shatter. I didn't know where the tea was kept, so I settled on plain hot water, not wanting to disturb anything more. Even the click of the kettle switch made me wince. I felt like every noise I made wrote itself in bold across their walls. "She's here, she's here, she's here." When my daughter-in-law came in, it was like I'd been caught sneaking sweets. She wore her hair tied up, face still puffy from sleep. She glanced at the kettle, then at me. "You didn't have to get up," she said softly, but it didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like I'd crossed some invisible line, like my being up before her in her kitchen was some kind of violation I hadn't been warned about. "I didn't mean to wake anyone," I replied. "It's just habit." She smiled politely, that strained kind of smile that pulls more at the skin than the heart. Then she busied herself with something in the fridge, yogurt for the baby, I think, and I stood there, mug in hand, unsure whether I was allowed to sit. I took my cup to the living room and perched on the edge of the couch, like a guest waiting for the doctor. The baby started crying upstairs, a hungry cry, sharp and high. My body reacted before I even thought. I was halfway up the stairs before I caught myself, before I remembered this wasn't my house, not my place, not my child. I stopped, listened. A moment later, I heard her footsteps pass me on the stairs. She glanced at me, brows slightly raised as if I were blocking her path. "I've got him," she said. I nodded and stepped aside. That was the moment I started shrinking. It's strange how quickly you can become a shadow in someone else's home. You go from mother to guest to ghost in the span of hours. I spent the rest of the morning rearranging my things in the guest room, not that I had much. A small suitcase, a framed photo of my late husband, a wool sweater I always wore when I felt uneasy. I folded things that didn't need folding, smoothed the sheets again and again like I was trying to iron my presence into invisibility. When lunchtime came, I stayed upstairs, not sure if I was expected. I heard them talking, clinking plates, the soft babble of the baby. I waited for someone to call me down. No one did. Eventually, I came down on my own stomach hollow and headlight. The table was cleared. The dishwasher hummed. My son was back at work in the study. His wife was spoon-feeding the baby in the high chair, her back turned to me. I opened the fridge quietly and found a banana. Ate it over the sink. She glanced over once, said nothing. That evening we sat together in the living room, the 3 of us technically, though it felt like 2 plus a quiet inconvenience. They watched something on the TV, a comedy, laughter and music and bright lights. But I wasn't really watching. I was pretending. smiling when they did, chuckling at nothing, hoping my silence didn't feel like judgment. The baby toddled over to me at one point, drooling and grinning, and I lifted him gently into my lap. My heart swelled a reflex. I kissed his hair and rocked a little, humming a lullaby I used to sing to his father. For a moment I felt rooted again, like I was part of something, like the thread of generations still tied me to this family. Then she stood up. "He's probably tired," she said, arms outstretched. I hesitated. She took him softly but firmly, and the warmth left my arms. "I'll put him down," she added. I watched her walk away, his tiny head on her shoulder. He looked back at me for a second, just 1 second. Then they disappeared up the stairs, and I was alone again in a room that didn't remember me. My son looked up from his phone. "You okay, Mom?" I smiled. "Of course," I said. It was the kind of cry that cut through walls, not a whimper or a fuss, but a sharp, aching wail that only a mother could ignore long enough to call it normal. But I wasn't his mother. I was just the woman who had once soothed another child's cries in the middle of the night, night after night, until he grew into a man who forgot how many times I rocked him back to sleep. I heard it from the guest room. That desperate wet sound and instinct pulled me from the bed before my mind even registered it. I opened my door softly and stepped into the hallway. The nursery door was cracked open, the light dim. I could hear her voice, my daughter-in-law, hushed and sharp at the edges. I don't think she meant to sound annoyed, but I knew that tone. It was the voice of someone at the edge of exhaustion, someone not quite angry, but far from tender. And I, like a fool, thought I could help. I tapped lightly on the door frame and peered in. "Would you like me to hold him?" I asked, already stepping forward, hands extended like muscle memory, like I was slipping back into something that used to be mine. She looked up, startled. "No, it's fine," she said quickly, too quickly. The baby, blotchy-faced and hiccuping from the force of his sobs, reached toward me anyway. His little hands flailed in my direction, fingers curled like he was asking for rescue. My heart cracked wide and fast and deep. "Are you sure?" I asked, gently taking one more step. Her shoulders stiffened. "Yes," she said. "It's better if I do it." I stopped. My arms fell to my sides. I nodded, pretending I understood. She didn't say it, but she didn't have to. This isn't your place. This isn't your child. You're not part of this. I turned away, slow and silent, back to the room that wasn't mine. I closed the door without latching it, as if some part of me still hoped to be called back. But the call never came. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. These hands that had cooked and cleaned, comforted, and carried bandaged knees and broken hearts. Hands that had held my dying husband's face as he whispered his last breath. Now they trembled with uselessness. I folded them in my lap, like they needed to be hidden, like they were shameful somehow, as if wanting to hold my grandchild had been a step too far. Later that night, as the house slipped into its hush of sleep, I lay in the dark and listened. Every creak of the walls, every faint rustle of sheets reminded me that I didn't belong to this life anymore. I was a visitor in something that once grew out of me, but now stood entirely apart. I thought about all the times I had cried alone when my son was small, when his father worked late or disappeared into silence. I had cried and kept going through fevers and tantrums, through school bullies and teenage rebellions, and never once had I told my son his tears were an inconvenience. I had welcomed them, held them, healed them. But now my own tears felt embarrassing, indulgent. I wiped them before they could reach the pillow. I didn't want to stain anything in that perfect room. The next morning I tried again. I offered to take the baby for a walk, give them a break, get some fresh air. My son said, "That's sweet, Mom, but we have a routine." Routine, like I was a disruption, a wrinkle in the smooth fabric of their life. His wife said, "He's not used to being out for long and the stroller's a bit complicated." I nodded. What I wanted to say was, I raised your husband without a stroller that folded itself or a baby monitor that sings lullabies. I bathed him in a sink, rocked him in a chair with springs that squeaked and still made it through the night. But I said nothing. That silence became my home. I started keeping track of how many times I was gently told no, how often I was reassured with words that felt more like walls. I wasn't being mistreated. No one yelled. No one was cruel. It was just the steady erosion of inclusion. The way each interaction reminded me, "You're not needed here. You're just here." The baby stopped reaching for me, and somehow that hurt most of all. It happened on the fourth day, the day I realized that meals no longer meant gathering. At home, when my husband was still alive, dinner was sacred. No matter how tired we were, how angry, how distant, we always sat together at the table. We passed bowls. We said things like, "How was your day?" even if we already knew the answer. It wasn't about food. It was about ritual, presence. But here, it was something else, something colder, quieter. I had gone to the kitchen early, eager to help. I missed the feeling of chopping vegetables, of oil hissing in a pan, of someone asking, "Is it ready yet?" I stood near the counter, unsure of whether to begin. The fridge was full, but I didn't know what was off limits. Everything was so organized. Labels, meal plans, tiny containers with dates. A foreign language of efficiency I hadn't learned. When she came in, my daughter-in-law, she smiled faintly. "Oh, don't worry about cooking," she said. "We've already got dinner sorted." "Oh," I replied, stepping back. "Of course." I stood there like furniture for a few moments before pretending I had something to do in my room. By the time I came back down, the smell of roasted chicken lingered, but the plates were already in the sink. Their son, my son, was rinsing his hands, saying something about needing to log back into work. She was feeding the baby at the high chair, one spoonful at a time, phone in the other hand. "Oh, we didn't know if you were coming down," she said when she saw me. "There's a plate for you in the oven." I kept it warm. The words sounded kind. They really did. But something about the way they didn't look at me, the way they didn't wait, made that plate feel more like leftovers than a place at the table. I sat alone, the television murmuring from the living room. My fork scraped the porcelain louder than I wanted. Every sound I made felt like an intrusion. The food was good. Of course it was. She was a good cook, methodical, clean, precise. But there was no warmth in it, no excess, no extra spoonfuls offered with a chuckle. No elbows nudging mine at the table, just perfectly seasoned silence. Halfway through, my son walked past, phone to his ear, nodded at me like a neighbor might. "Everything good, Mom?" I nodded. "Delicious," I said. He didn't stop walking. I ate slowly, not because I was savoring it, but because rushing back to my room felt like defeat. I tried to imagine how I would have treated my own mother if she had come to live with me. I wondered whether I would have done the same, made her feel politely invisible. I wanted to say no. I wanted to believe I'd have pulled out her chair, asked for her stories, listened to her corrections even when they annoyed me. After dinner, I washed my plate and dried it by hand. I didn't know where they kept the dish towels, so I found one on the counter and hoped it wasn't decorative. I didn't want to be the reason something looked off. Later that night, I sat by the window in my room looking out over their backyard, neat rows of grass-trimmed hedges, a little garden with sprouting herbs. I could see the baby's toys stacked by the fence, a little red ball, a plastic truck, things my son would have loved when he was that age, things I had once saved up to buy, sacrificing my own needs so he could have birthday surprises and hand-me-downs that didn't look too hand-me-downed. I remembered all the times we ate dinner together when he was small. He would talk with his mouth full, tell me stories about school, about dinosaurs, about dreams. I remembered how proud he was when he learned to set the table himself, spoon, fork, and napkin, all in the wrong places, but perfect to me. I remembered the nights he didn't eat much, and I'd worry, and the nights he went for thirds, and I'd laugh and say, "You're growing too fast." Now he was grown, and I wasn't part of the table anymore. They didn't mean to be unkind. I believe that. They were just used to a life I didn't fit into, a schedule, a rhythm, a shape that didn't include my edges, and I was too afraid or too proud to say I feel left out. So I stayed quiet, ate alone, smiled when they passed me in the hall, and whispered goodnight into a room that didn't answer back. It was a question, technically, but it landed like a reprimand. I had only been trying to help. The kitchen drawer was cluttered, mismatched utensils jumbled together, some sharp, some slippery, all tangled like no one had taken the time to sort them. So I did what I'd always done. I brought order, lined up the forks, grouped the spoons, tucked away the items that didn't belong. It was a small gesture, the kind a mother does without thinking, the kind I used to do in the background of my son's life while he ran from one thing to another. I thought it might even be appreciated. But that afternoon I heard her opening the drawer, pause, then call out, "Can you not rearrange things?" Not rude, not even loud, but not warm either. I stood there by the sink with a sponge in my hand and the words hanging between us. "Oh," I said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to overstep. I just thought I'd tidy up a little." She closed the drawer more gently than necessary and smiled that tight, polite smile again. "It's just that we have a system," she replied. "I know where everything is, even if it looks messy. But thank you." She left it at that, and I was left in the kitchen not sure what to do with my hands anymore. I rinsed the sponge, wiped the already clean counter, and quietly slipped out like steam fading from a cup. God. It's strange the way small corrections can cut so deeply, not because they're cruel, but because they remind you you're not home. You're visiting, and visitors don't move things around. I went back upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed. The room was too clean, not a single drawer out of place. Not a wrinkle in the comforter unless I made one. My little suitcase sat by the wall untouched since I arrived. I hadn't unpacked fully. Somehow some part of me already knew. Later that day I tried again. I offered to fold the laundry. She had left it in a basket in the hallway unfolded as if it had been waiting for someone to notice. And I did. I folded everything gently, smoothing the sleeves, aligning the corners, stacking the baby's onesies in careful piles by size. She came upstairs just as I was finishing. Her smile faltered. "Oh, I was going to do that," she said. "I didn't mean to take it from you," I replied quickly. "Just thought I'd help." There was a pause, one of those pauses that feels longer than it is. Then she said, "It's okay. Thanks." But I saw it in her eyes, that look of someone trying not to be annoyed, of someone too polite to say what they really meant. From that point on, I stopped touching anything that wasn't mine. No drawers, no baskets, no toys left out. I sat like a folded napkin in their lives, neat and out of the way. One afternoon, my son came home early and found me in the backyard watering a few drooping herbs. It was a small thing, a quiet thing. I had noticed they were thirsty. I thought I'd do something gentle, something that wouldn't provoke. He smiled, sort of. "You don't have to do chores, Mom," he said. "We want you to rest." I nodded, pretending the words were kind, but what they sounded like was, "Please stop leaving fingerprints." I looked at him, this man I had raised. This boy who once cried when I cut his sandwich the wrong way. This child I had fed from my own plate when food was scarce. And now I didn't even know where I was allowed to stand. That night I sat in my room and ran my fingers along the edges of the photo frame on the nightstand. It was the only piece of home I had brought with me. My husband's smile in that picture was warm, real, a little crooked. He would have hated this feeling. He would have said something not angrily, but firmly. I was always the one who bit her tongue, waited for the right time, smoothed things over. But the smoothing was wearing thin. I thought about leaving, just for a second, just as a whisper, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. Not really. My house was still there, but it felt empty without him. Cold. The kind of place where you don't make noise because you're afraid no one will answer. Here I wasn't sure which was worse, the loneliness of being alone or the loneliness of not being wanted. So I stayed, smiled, sat at the edge of their world like a forgotten corner of furniture. And I learned to apologize with silence. I wasn't trying to listen, but walls, even pretty ones, don't hold secrets very well, especially not late at night when the house has settled into its hush, the baby asleep, the dishes washed, the lights dimmed down to their quietest glow. That's when people let their voices slip, not loud enough to admit anything outright, just soft enough to pretend it wasn't meant to be heard. It started with a name, my name. I had been brushing my hair, an old habit I clung to, even though I no longer had anyone to brush it for. Each stroke through the strands was a small rhythm of comfort, a tether to a version of myself that had once felt beautiful, useful, seen. Then I heard it. My son's voice hushed firm, almost weary. I know, but she just needs time. Then hers sharper, even when quiet. I just didn't think it would be this constant. There was a pause. I stopped brushing. She's always in the kitchen, and the baby, he's getting confused. He keeps reaching for her. It's throwing everything off. My heart clenched, not from the words themselves, but from the shame they carried neatly packed in concern. I set the brush down, moved closer to the door, not out of spite, but instinct, the same way you lean in when someone speaks your name in a dream. I'm not saying she's doing anything wrong, she added. This was supposed to be temporary. Temporary. That word floated through me like cold water. It seeped into the bones, drenched everything. I backed away from the door, sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. I couldn't remember the last time someone whispered about me in my own home. I used to be the one holding the walls together, filling the house with meals and laughter and laundry and presents. Now I was something to be discussed, managed, softened, phased out. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with my eyes closed, heart thudding like it had somewhere to be, but didn't know where. I thought about how many times I had whispered about people in my life, never in malice, but in frustration. And I wondered, had I made someone feel this way? Had I once spoken about my own mother, my sister, some friend who overstayed with that same tone of, we just didn't expect it to be this much? If I had, I wished I could go back and undo it. The next morning I was quiet, quieter than usual. I didn't go to the kitchen early. I waited until I heard footsteps, dishes clinking the buzz of the refrigerator. Then I came down slowly, deliberately, asking for nothing. I poured myself a glass of water and sat by the window with a book I couldn't focus on. They were already eating. Toast, eggs, laughter. The baby clapped his hands, delighted by something I hadn't seen. My son looked up and said, "Morning, Mom." I smiled. She said nothing. That day I didn't offer to help. I didn't ask questions. I didn't touch the laundry or open the drawer. I watched the baby from a distance, even when he waddled toward me with a toy in hand. I smiled and said, "Go show Mama," and watched him turn away confused. That night, I left a note on the nightstand, just a folded piece of paper. Not for them, for me. "You are not invisible. You are just in the wrong place." It wasn't anger I felt. It wasn't even sadness. It was something quieter, a letting go, like loosening your grip on a rope that was never tied to you in the first place. I wasn't angry with them, but I was beginning to remember what it felt like to be disappointed, and how heavy it was to keep pretending you weren't. That's how it began, not with a conversation, not even with a request, but with a pillow. One of those decorative ones, the kind people buy to match the curtains or fill an empty corner. Only this one wasn't decorative. It was purposeful. It was placed carefully on the couch, along with a folded blanket and a clean set of sheets, resting neatly on the coffee table beside it. At first I didn't understand. It was late. I had been upstairs brushing my teeth, ready to settle into the unfamiliar stillness of the guest room. When I came back down to refill my water, I saw it there. The couch made up like a bed, the space prepared. It was too deliberate to be a mistake. I stood there for a moment, blinking at the arrangement. Then I heard her voice, gentle, rehearsed. "We thought maybe just for a night or two." The baby's teething, and we keep going back and forth to the guest room. It's been hard with all the creaking, and he doesn't sleep well when there's noise in the hallway. I turned to look at her. She was wringing her hands, not quite meeting my eyes. My son appeared behind her, silent. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just looked at the floor like he was trying to disappear into it. I opened my mouth to say something. I'm not loud. I stay still. I haven't touched anything, but the words curled back into my throat. Pride, perhaps, or fatigue, or that old instinct women have when we're being gently moved aside. The same instinct that tells us don't make a fuss, don't make them feel bad, don't ask for more than they're willing to give. So I nodded, smiled even, said, "Of course, I understand." They thanked me, both of them, twice. I carried my water glass into the living room and sat down on the edge of the couch. My knees ached more than usual. The cushions were firmer than I expected. I reached for the blanket and spread it across my lap. It smelled like lavender, not the comforting kind, but the artificial kind, like detergent and distance. That night I lay curled in a space meant for sitting, not sleeping. Every time I shifted, the leather sighed beneath me. I could hear the baby crying upstairs, muffled and intermittent. A sound I used to respond to without thinking. A sound I was no longer invited to soothe. I stared at the ceiling and thought, I'm not even in a bedroom anymore. It was a small thing, but it wasn't small. The next morning she apologized again, said it was just temporary until the baby got through this rough patch. "We just need our rhythm back," she said. Rhythm. I wondered when I had fallen out of step. My son handed me a coffee in a travel mug, like I was going somewhere. I thanked him, sat outside on the porch to drink it. The mug was too hot, the lid loose, but I held it anyway. From where I sat, I could see the inside of their home, the hallway, the stairs, the hum of morning life unfolding in quiet, well-practiced movements. The kind of life you build when everyone knows their place. I was no longer sure what mine was. When I came back in, my sheets were folded. The pillow was gone. The couch looked like nothing had happened, and I felt erased. That day I stayed out longer, took a walk, sat on a park bench, and watched strangers feed pigeons and talk to their dogs. One woman, maybe close to my age, smiled at me as she passed. I almost stopped her, almost said, "Do you know what it feels like to live in a house and not be seen?" But I didn't. I just smiled back and tucked the thought away, like a letter I'd never send. When I returned home, their home, no one asked where I'd been. They were busy. That's what I told myself. Busy, not unkind, just distracted, occupied, tired. I had become the pause between their sentences, the polite silence after the punchline, the space in their life they hadn't asked for, but were trying their best to accommodate. And even so, I still said thank you when they handed me a plate. I still folded the blanket at the end of each night. I still smiled when my son walked past me like I was part of the furniture, because I thought maybe if I stayed quiet enough, still enough, small enough, they'd remember. But they didn't. I was brushing crumbs off the coffee table when I heard it. Not a yell, not a fight, just that quiet, serious tone people use when they don't want to be overheard, but no longer care if they are. The hallway carried sound like a narrow river, and I stood still frozen, a cloth in my hand and something heavier in my chest. "She's not doing anything wrong," my son said. His voice was soft, strained. "That's not the point," she replied. "It's not about wrong. It's about the energy in the house. Everything feels off." There was a pause, that kind of long, delicate pause, where both people wait for the other to say what they're both thinking. "She watches everything," she continued. "She hovers. She doesn't mean to, but I feel like I can't breathe in my own home." My breath caught. I took a small step back, trying not to make the floor creak. The cloth in my hand was damp and cooling. I gripped it tighter, like that would anchor me to the room and not let me dissolve into it. "She's trying," my son said. "It's only been a week." "A week is long enough when your whole routine falls apart," she whispered. "I'm sorry, but this isn't working." My heart didn't break. It just stopped quiet, stunned like someone had knocked the wind from me without touching me at all. I heard footsteps approaching and hurried back to the kitchen, placing the cloth neatly beside the sink, adjusting my expression like someone fixing her makeup before going on stage. He came in first, eyes darting. She stayed behind. "Hey, Mom," he said, his tone too light, too forced. "Can we talk for a second?" I nodded. We moved to the dining table, the one I had only eaten at once. I sat. He stood for a moment, then sighed and joined me. "I just want to make sure you're okay," he began. "I'm fine," I said. He looked relieved, almost hopeful. "It's just, you've probably noticed the house is a bit hectic right now. The baby work, everything." I nodded slowly. "I think maybe we didn't think this through," he said. "We love you. Of course we do. But the space, it's just not really suited for long-term living. For 3 adults and a baby." I heard everything he didn't say. "You're in the way. She's not comfortable. We need our life back." I sat perfectly still. "I understand," I said. He blinked. "You do?" Of course, I whispered. I was never supposed to stay long, just until I found my feet again. His shoulders softened. "Maybe just a few more days, and then we can help you settle back into your place. Get you whatever you need." I smiled. I even reached out and touched his hand. It felt different than I remembered, bigger, colder, somehow further away than ever. "Thank you," I said. He left the room with a relieved sigh. I stayed behind. I sat at that table until the sun dipped below the window. The light shifted across the wood like it was brushing over a grave. I remembered all the times he had sat across from me as a child, swinging his legs under the table, asking for second helpings, drawing on napkins. All the times I had reached across that same kind of table to tuck his hair behind his ear or clean crumbs from his cheek. And now that same hand had gently ushered me out of his life. Not cruelly, just decisively. That night I didn't cry. I went to the couch, folded the blanket, placed the pillow just so, and lay down with my hands folded across my chest like someone practicing for the end. I listened to their voices upstairs, soft, satisfied, a quiet return to normal. And I thought, this is the moment. This is when I finally disappear from their story. I waited until the house was still, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from conclusion. My son was upstairs, likely asleep beside the wife who had mastered the art of polite distance. The baby had long since stopped crying. The only sound was the whisper of the refrigerator and the small creaks of a house settling in for the night, or maybe settling after me. I stood in the living room looking around one last time. It hadn't become familiar. Not really. There were no dents in the cushions where I'd sat day after day, no clutter to betray my presence. Nothing of mine had spilled out beyond the borders of the guest room or the couch. I had made myself small here, careful, folded, and now I was folding again, my clothes, my grief, my hopes. I went upstairs without turning on the light. I didn't want to wake anyone, didn't want to explain. The guest room greeted me like a waiting hotel. The bed was neatly made as it always was. The drawers were still closed, untouched, just like I'd left them. My suitcase was where I'd placed it that first day, unopened for days, as if I'd never really arrived. I moved slowly. I didn't have much to gather. A sweater, a few nightgowns, my toothbrush. The framed photo of my husband, I wrapped it in a scarf, the one he used to call your Sunday shawl. I ran my hand over the bed once just to remember how it felt. Not soft, not warm, but polite. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said in silences, in glances, in late-night hallway conversations I wasn't meant to hear. I thought about leaving a thank you, but I wasn't sure what I was thanking them for. The ride home was quiet. I called for a car while standing at the edge of the front porch, the same porch I had stood on when I first arrived. Then it had felt like the start of a new chapter, a tender rescue from grief. Now it felt like a revolving door I had been spun out of. I didn't tell them I was going. I didn't want the apology, or worse, the relief. The driver didn't ask questions, just helped me with my bag and nodded politely. I watched the house get smaller in the rearview mirror. The curtains were drawn. The lights in the nursery were off. No one waved. No one noticed. When I arrived back at my old apartment, everything was where I had left it. The quiet was different here, not cold, but mine. The photos on the wall didn't look at me with judgment. The worn couch welcomed me like an old friend. The dust in the corners seemed to sigh with recognition. I opened the windows and let in the air. It smelled like dust and absence. I didn't mind. I unpacked slowly, deliberately. I smoothed my clothes into drawers, hung my shawl on the back of the chair, placed my husband's photo by the bedside where it had lived for decades. I made tea, not out of habit but out of need. For warmth, for something to hold. And then I sat, alone, but not lonely. There's a difference, I realized. Loneliness is what I felt in that beautiful house where everything was clean but nothing was tender. Alone is what I felt now, wrapped in memories and quiet, in the echo of a life that was mine, however overlooked it had been. No one called that night, no missed messages, no follow-ups, and somehow that made things easier. It meant the silence was mutual, agreed upon, understood. I slept in my own bed, not a couch, not a borrowed mattress in a house where I wasn't welcome. My bed slightly too firm, slightly too cold on one side, but mine. And when I closed my eyes, I didn't dream of their home. I dreamed of my kitchen years ago with my son at the table and his father humming over the stove. I dreamed of warmth, of noise, of being seen. And then I dreamed of nothing, which in some ways was the deepest peace of all. When I turned the key and stepped through the door, it felt like entering a museum of a life no longer being lived. The air was still thick with dust, and the faint scent of lavender cleaner I had sprayed before I left, thinking I'd be back in a few days or maybe weeks. I hadn't planned on returning so soon. I hadn't planned on returning at all. But here I was. The curtains were just as I'd left them, drawn halfway, letting in the dull gray of an overcast morning. The sofa, the same one my husband used to nap on, with a blanket around his shoulders, sat waiting. My slippers were still by the side of the bed. My teacup was still in the sink. Everything waited patiently for me. Everything but them. I stood in the middle of the room with my suitcase and let the silence settle over me. It was a different kind of silence, not hostile, not watchful, just indifferent. My things didn't notice I was back. They didn't have expectations. They didn't shrink away. I put the kettle on and moved slowly through the space, brushing my fingers across the back of the chair, adjusting a photograph frame that had tilted slightly. My husband's face smiled back at me. He always looked a little unsure in photos, like he wasn't quite comfortable being captured. I touched his cheek in the glass and whispered, "You wouldn't have let them do that to me." He wouldn't have. I know that now. We had our flaws, he and I. Years, filled with arguments, dry spells, and those long silences that settle into a marriage like a second skin. But he never made me feel like I was in the way. Even at his most distant, I was never a burden. I drank my tea standing up, unsure of where to sit. Everything felt too big and too small all at once. Eventually, I chose the armchair by the window and watched the street, waiting for something to happen. It didn't. Hours passed, like they often do in houses meant for one slowly, and then all at once. The sun crept along the floorboards. A neighbor's dog barked. Someone's television echoed faintly through the wall. And me, I just existed. No one called. No one knocked. No messages lit up my phone. By evening, I lit a candle just to feel less alone. It flickered quietly on the kitchen table, casting gentle shadows on the walls. I made a simple dinner: rice, eggs, a splash of soy sauce. The kind of meal you make when your appetite isn't strong, but you know you must eat. I sat across from an empty chair and chewed slowly, watching the candle dance. I didn't cry. Maybe I should have, but there was something about this place, this return, that felt like clarity rather than sorrow. I had chased after warmth in a house that only offered climate control. I had offered hands that had raised a child only to be met with retreat. And now I was here, in a home that didn't apologize for my presence, in a space that didn't flinch when I moved, in silence that didn't punish. That night, I folded my clothes and placed them gently back into drawers that remembered their shape. I turned back the bed not just for sleep, but for rest, the kind of rest that comes after you stop trying to belong where you're not welcome. I lay down and stared at the ceiling fan, watching the slow spin, the predictable rhythm. I thought about my son, his tired eyes, his guilt-muted words. I thought about the way he used to run into my arms as a boy, shouting "Mama" like it was the only word he knew. I thought about the way he didn't look me in the eye when he asked me to leave. And I whispered, "It's okay." Not because it was, but because there was no one left to convince otherwise. There were so many moments I could have spoken words perched on the edge of my throat, ready to take flight. But I held them, again and again. I swallowed every small protest, every quiet ache, every soft "why that" might have turned into a plea. I told myself that silence was grace, that silence was strength. But sometimes silence is just what happens when you realize no one is really listening. The day after I returned home, I sat by the window and replayed the entire week like a worn-out reel. Not the big moments, no. Not the conversation in the hallway or the pillow on the couch. The small ones, the glances, the way my daughter-in-law never really used my name. The way my son's voice changed when he spoke to me versus when he spoke to her. the way the baby's giggles filled the room until I entered it. I thought about the first time I offered to hold him and how quickly she took him back. I thought about how often I had to ask where things were and how each question seemed to chip away at their patience. And I thought about how many times I smiled through it, not because I was happy, but because I didn't know what else to do. What I didn't say, I feel unwanted. What I didn't say, I raised you with everything I had, and now I'm scared to boil water in your house. What I didn't say, I gave up pieces of myself so you could become who you are, and now you look at me like I'm a stranger asking for too much. And worst of all, what I didn't say, you hurt me. I didn't say it because I didn't want to see that flicker of guilt in his eyes. Guilt has a way of turning to defensiveness, and I didn't have the energy to explain why I wasn't attacking. I didn't want an apology built from discomfort. I wanted understanding, and that I realized might never come. I thought about my own mother then. She had been softer than me, quieter. She used to fold her hands in her lap when she was overwhelmed. I do the same now. Back then, I thought she was too passive. I used to think, speak up, say something. Now I wonder if she had been swallowing the same bitter mouthfuls I had holding in truths she knew wouldn't be received the way they needed to be. There's a loneliness in not speaking, but there's a different kind of loneliness in speaking and being dismissed. I chose the first. Maybe that was my mistake. Later that evening, I opened a drawer and found a stack of old letters, notes my son had written me as a boy. Happy Mother's Day. You're the best mom ever. Thanks for always being there. I ran my fingers over the shaky handwriting and let myself feel it, not the words but the distance between then and now. What would that little boy think if he saw his grown self now? Would he be proud, embarrassed? Would he recognize the woman on the couch as the same one who once made him pancakes shaped like dinosaurs? I tucked the letters back away gently. They weren't lies, just moments. Moments frozen in time before life's weight made everything more complicated. And still I didn't reach out. I didn't call. I didn't ask him if he missed me, or if the house felt any different with me gone. I didn't want to hear politeness again. I didn't want the sigh before the answer. I just wanted to sit with my silence, not as punishment, but as choice. Sometimes what we don't say is the most honest part of us. That word burden, it never left their mouths, but it hung in the air like steam from a pot that never quite boiled over. It clung to the corners of the house, to their tone, to the way she looked past me instead of at me. I heard it in how gently I was corrected. I felt it in the space they left between their lives and mine, and slowly, like water carving stone, I began to believe it. I hadn't always been afraid to take up space. There was a time when I was the space, the axis. Everything spun around. The one who remembered birthdays, signed permission slips, paid late fees, wiped noses, and smiled through exhaustion, because I believed that being needed was the same as being loved. But there's something cruel in how motherhood fades. One day you're the person everyone runs to, and the next you're the reason they sigh when you ask for help. The same hands that once wiped away tears now shake too much to slice fruit quickly. The same lap that once held the weight of your world is now an obstacle to someone else's schedule. I thought about the times I'd gone without so they wouldn't have to. The coat I didn't buy that winter because he needed new boots. The overtime shifts. The late-night worry. The meals I skipped pretending I wasn't hungry so the fridge would stretch just a bit longer. Back then it felt like love. Now I wonder if it just taught them I'd never ask for anything. Because when I finally did, when I allowed myself to say yes to a simple offer of shelter, I was made to feel like I had taken something I shouldn't. It wasn't that they said I was a burden. It was that they rearranged their house to keep me from touching anything, that they spoke in lowered tones and called it just needing space, that their kindness had terms I wasn't told until I'd already crossed them. I remember standing in the hallway once holding the baby. He had fallen asleep on my shoulder, his little breaths warm against my neck. I hadn't meant to hold him so long, but he had been fussy, and my arms knew what to do. I was swaying, humming gently, lost in memory. Then she appeared at the end of the hall. "Oh," she said, "I was looking for him." I handed him over, and her arms were firm. Not unkind, but firm. I wanted to say he's comfortable with me. I'm not stealing him. I just wanted to help. But I didn't, because by then I'd learned that even help could be unwanted if it came from someone you're quietly trying to move out. And my son, sweet, conflicted, apologetic, even when silent, didn't know how to bridge the space between us. I saw it in the way he looked at me during dinner, like he wanted to say more, but feared the reaction, like he remembered too late that I was once the woman who stayed up all night to keep monsters from his room. Now he treated me like the monster was me. That's the cost of being a burden. You become a shadow in the house you once dreamed of dying peacefully in. You learn to silence yourself before anyone else has to. You fold your grief like laundry and tuck it into drawers they won't open. You tell yourself it's just temporary, even when you feel it tightening around you like a rope. That evening, alone in my apartment again, I looked at the tea I'd made and realized I didn't want it. I poured it down the sink and stood there watching it swirl away. Maybe I had expected too much. Maybe I had asked for something love couldn't give. Or maybe, just maybe, I had believed the lie. All mothers are told that our sacrifices are seeds that bloom into lifelong gratitude. But sometimes they bloom into distance and silence, and carefully folded blankets on couches that weren't meant for sleep. It took me 3 days before I texted him, not because I didn't want to, I thought about it constantly, but because I was afraid of what the delay in response would mean, afraid of the polite tone, afraid of reading my own longing in the cold, dry shapes of words that would never be enough. I stared at my phone every morning like it might tell me something before I even touched it. Just a little light, a ping, "How are you, Mom?" Anything. But it never lit up, not once. When I finally did text, I kept it simple. I just wanted to say, I hope everything's going okay. I missed the baby's laugh. I stared at it for nearly an hour before hitting send. My thumb hovered trembling. I didn't want to sound needy, or bitter, or worse, desperate for their affection. I just wanted to be remembered. The message was marked, delivered within seconds, and then nothing. Hours passed. I made tea, washed dishes, organized the cupboard I had ignored for months. I even took out an old recipe book, hoping to distract myself by baking something. But the flour had gone hard in the bag, and the sugar jar was nearly empty. I gave up halfway through, sat down again. Still nothing. When the reply came well past dinner, it read, "Thanks, Mom. Things are good. Hope you're settling back in." Settling back in, as if I had moved into a vacation home for a weekend and come back sun-kissed and refreshed, not crumpled, not quieter, not smaller in some way I hadn't been before. I typed a reply. "Yes, all good here, too. Let me know if you need anything." Then I stared at that sentence. If you need anything. The absurdity of it made me want to laugh, or cry, or maybe both. Because what I meant was I still want to help. I still want to feel useful. But what I really meant was, please don't forget me. I erased it and sent nothing. Days passed. No calls, no updates. I stopped checking my phone every hour, then every day. Then slowly, it just became something that lived on the coffee table, silent and still, like everything else in my apartment. Instead, I learned new ways to pass the time. I found a radio station that played old love songs in the early afternoon. I started taking longer walks. I bought a crossword puzzle book from the little shop down the street and left it open on the table pen nestled neatly beside it, like a promise to myself. And I started talking to myself. Not in a strange way, not full conversations, just little things, while folding laundry, while making soup. That's too much salt. That drawer needs oil. He used to love this song. Quiet acknowledgments that I was still here, that my voice still mattered, even if no one else heard it. Sometimes I'd pick up my phone and start typing a message about a memory. A funny thing, I saw a photo I came across, but I rarely sent them. Instead, I'd save them to a folder called Maybe Later. It's still there, filled with unsent words. Some days I wish I could say what I really feel. I'm not angry, just hollow. I don't want anything from you, just a moment. I raised you to be kind, and now I wonder if I taught you how to look through people when it's convenient. But then I imagine him reading those words, sighing, showing her, and both of them saying she's being dramatic again. So I keep them inside. There's a kind of strength in not reaching out, in letting someone go even while your heart stays tethered to the sound of their childhood voice. I used to call to say, be careful, drive safe, I'm proud of you. Now I don't call at all. Not because I stopped caring, but because I learned that some silences are kinder than being reminded that your voice no longer makes anyone turn their head. It was raining the day she knocked, just a gentle drizzle, the kind that makes the air smell like wet earth and forgotten memories. I had been standing by the window, holding a lukewarm cup of tea, watching the droplets race each other down the glass. There was something oddly soothing about it, like the sky had decided to cry on my behalf. Then came the knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever really came by anymore. So when I opened the door and saw the woman from 2 doors down, I was surprised. She held a small Tupperware container and wore a raincoat dotted with faded sunflowers. Her smile was hesitant, but genuine. I made too much soup, she said. Thought you might like some. I blinked. Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. She handed it over like it was nothing, like it wasn't the first warm gesture I'd received in weeks. It's chicken and rice. My daughter says it's too plain, but I like simple things. I thought maybe you would too. She was right, I did. That night, I warmed it up slowly on the stove, letting the smell fill the apartment. It wasn't fancy, just broth, soft grains, shredded meat, but it tasted like care, like someone had thought of me without needing to. I sat at the table and ate every spoonful. I didn't rush. I let it linger. The next day, I left a thank you note on her doorstep, wrapped around a little sachet of dried lavender I'd kept in my drawer. I wrote, "It was exactly what I needed. You reminded me how much a small kindness matters." She waved at me later that week, invited me for tea. Nothing formal, just 2 women older than we feel sitting on creaky chairs and talking about how quiet the world can become if you don't fight to keep it soft. And in those moments, I realized something. Kindness doesn't always come from where you planted it. Sometimes it blooms wild in the places you never expected, in the smile of a stranger, in the hum of a shared silence, in the clink of a teacup on a worn saucer. And when it does, you learn to stop chasing warmth from people who've forgotten how to give it. You start making room for the unexpected tenderness of new beginnings. I found myself walking more, pausing to chat with the woman at the corner market, nodding to the boy who delivers mail with earbuds in his ears, and a polite, distracted grin. None of them knew my story. None of them had watched me shrink in a house built on conditional love. But they saw me, they greeted me, and they expected nothing from me but a returned smile. It felt like breathing again. Sometimes when I couldn't sleep, I'd sit on the balcony wrapped in a blanket and watch the city lights flicker like fireflies. Somewhere, out there, my son was living his quiet life. Maybe they laughed more without me there. Maybe the baby had stopped reaching for me. Maybe she finally felt like her home was whole again. And yet, I didn't feel anger, just a quiet ache like a bruise you forget until you touch it again. The next morning, I woke early and made a pot of soup, the same chicken and rice recipe, adding just a little more garlic, just how I like it. I ladled it into 2 bowls and set one aside, not for anyone, just in case. Because even now I still believe in offering warmth, but only to those who don't make me feel like I have to apologize for it. It didn't happen all at once. There was no grand declaration, no slam of a door or tearful goodbye. It was quieter than that. A shift. A soft, deliberate turning away from a world that made me feel like I had to shrink in order to be loved. It began with the small things. I stopped rearranging my sentences to sound more agreeable. I stopped second-guessing every message I wanted to send. I stopped folding myself so neatly into the background that even my own reflection looked unsure of who I was. I started putting out the good plates for myself, lighting the candle, even if no one was coming over, playing music while I cooked, not to entertain someone else, but to remind myself that my days still deserved a soundtrack. One morning I stood in front of the mirror and let my eyes rest on every line in my face. I didn't sigh or flinch. I traced them with my gaze the way I used to trace the creases in my husband's hands, gently, reverently, as if they told a story worth reading. And they did. Every line, every soft fold was evidence of all I'd carried, all I'd given, all I'd survived. I took myself out for a walk that afternoon, wore the red scarf I'd tucked away for special occasions, sat at the cafe where no one knew my name, and ordered a pastry without checking the price. The girl behind the counter called me ma'am and handed me my change with a smile that didn't feel forced. And I smiled back not out of obligation, but because something inside me had finally settled, like dust after a storm. I had spent so much of my life apologizing for being too much, for not being enough, for needing help, for offering help, for taking up space, for lingering too long in a room where the warmth had run out. But I wasn't sorry anymore. I wasn't sorry for being a mother who gave everything and still wanted to feel wanted. I wasn't sorry for loving too fiercely, for offering my hands when no one asked, for holding on to memories that made others uncomfortable. I wasn't even sorry for saying yes to their invitation, even if it ended with me on a couch holding back tears under a blanket that smelled like lavender and distance. Because the truth is, I was never the problem. I was just the reminder of who they had been, of what it costs to be raised by someone who didn't stop loving you, even when it stopped being easy, of the hands that once fed and rocked and steadied them through every storm. Now I steady myself. I light my own candles. I make soup that doesn't need to impress anyone. I keep my silence, not the kind that begs for attention, but the kind that comes from peace. And when people say, "You're so strong," I don't argue. But I also don't smile like I used to, because strength wasn't a choice. It was what remained when no one came to lift the weight with me. I've learned that dignity isn't loud. It's not in declarations or confrontations. It's in the quiet choices to stay, to leave, to speak, to stay silent. And my choice now is this: I will not apologize for my presence. Not again. Not ever. Because I am still here. still whole, still worthy of being seen even if no one is looking. The apartment is quiet now, not the aching kind of quiet, not the kind that used to fill the corners with loneliness or wrap around my shoulders like a shiver, but a stillness I've come to welcome. It's the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own breath, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the gentle creak of the floor beneath you. The world no longer demanding just present, just here. Sometimes in the late afternoons, I sit by the window and watch the light move across the floor. It takes its time, slow and patient, like it has nowhere else to be. I think about that, about the slowness I used to fear the empty hours I thought would swallow me whole. And now I see them for what they are, a kind of freedom, a space that no longer asks me to explain myself. I think about my son, about the boy he was and the man he became, about the space between those two versions and how I lost my place somewhere in the middle. I don't blame him, not anymore. People forget where they came from when they're busy building where they're going. It's not cruelty, it's just a kind of forgetting that doesn't feel like forgetting to them. But I remember. I remember who I was before they saw me as an interruption. Before I was asked to keep my voice down, to stay in my room, to sleep on couches, and step lightly through lives that once grew from my own. I remember the woman who carried a family on her back and never once asked to be carried in return. And now I carry myself. Gently, without apology, with a kind of reverence I never knew I deserved. Because I do. Because even if they've moved on, even if the calls never come, and the visits remain postponed, I no longer need to be invited to feel whole. I no longer wait for the warmth of someone else's welcome. I've learned how to build my own quiet, steady mine. I didn't need to be loud. I just needed to leave. They forgot me, but I never forgot myself. I gave them silence, and in it I found peace.